Well, here we are at last. At the intersection of all fantasy stories are racist and you're not allowed to have your escapism. Amazon just released their long-awaited billion-dollar project, The Rings of Power, last week, and the results have been nothing short of disastrous. It's almost like the months-long ad campaigns that got ratioed to hell, as well as the outcry from fans of the obvious destruction of Tolkien's work, just wasn't enough of an indicator for Amazon that smashing success was not on the horizon. But as all things do when looked at through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, this quickly evolved into a coordinated media attack against so-called purists and racists that wouldn't kowtow to the progressive corporate agenda. The backlash to this perversion of Tolkien's work was quickly dismissed as being nothing more than the complaints of racist trolls and misogynists online that refused to get with the times. Sadly, this is not the first time we've seen such an attack on fans of a fantasy franchise. Most notably, there has been a movement online against the characterization of people of African descent as orcs. I'm not really sure when or how the comparison first came about, but it's telling that people who pride themselves as being anti-racist will be the first ones to connect the dots between an ethnic group in our modern world and a fictional race that is often depicted in a less than flattering light. While all orcs vary between fantasy worlds, they usually have a few things in common. They are either the minions of a great evil or are perceived to be less than human, and they are most untrustworthy creatures that you would never associate with. Overarching themes have them resembling pigs or mutilated elves, brute-like people with hideous faces and distorted features, so on and so on. Whether or not justified in each individual fantasy world, the orc tends to be disregarded as something not worth living. This is certainly the case in Tolkien's work. The first orcs were elves that were captured by Morgoth and twisted and distorted into vile, despicable beings that no longer resemble their former selves. They operated as an extension of their master and are not capable of achieving much on their own without constant leadership. This is where the comparison to African people, or the descendants of them around the globe, definitely shows a glimpse into the minds of these so-called anti-racists. It started years ago when articles generated online complaining that Dungeons & Dragons has always stigmatized the race of orcs, or more commonly the half-orcs, which as the name implies are also half-human. Negative racial debuffs, such as lower intelligence, were always balanced against higher strength, as another common theme among orcs spanning all fantasy is their proclivity to engage in combat. Somehow, these woke activists connected the dots between the lower intelligence and aggressive nature of the orc to African people as a whole. This of course is asinine at face value, but when this faux outrage started to get spread by several major media outlets online, it spread like wildfire to most every fantasy genre save one, The Lord of the Rings and the remaining works of Tolkien. As we are only 2 episodes into The Rings of Power, or The Rings of Prime as it should be called, there has been no sign as of yet that this ludicrous sentiment will be injected into the show. Instead, mainstream media and the shills for Amazon have taken the less nuanced approach and simply begun to call all critics of the show racist and sexist. Shocking. This was done deliberately with the casting choices that the showrunners made by choosing a more diverse cast than a Tolkien purist would have done, as well as retconning Galadriel's character by changing her from an ethereal, mysterious elf sorceress into a battle-hardened, kick-ass warrior that needs no man and has a constant expression of anger and annoyance on her face. Naturally, the true fans weren't having any of it. So what did the showrunners do? They used the diverse casting as a shield to blame the failure of the show not only on the missteps made by the showrunners, but by the racist fans that hate women and anyone that's slightly darker than my excessively creamy morning coffee. Branching off from orcs, however, we have recently seen the comparison made between goblins in the franchise Harry Potter and stereotypes of Jewish bankers. No, I wish I was kidding. This galaxy brain take originated from late-night unfunny man Jon Stewart on a podcast back in December of 2021. As I've never really cared to watch these particular films, I'm going to defer to the millions of fans that have loved this franchise and never made this correlation, and I'm just going to assume that Jon Stewart's full of last night's dinner. This wouldn't be the first time he's had a truly moronic take, and I'm sure it won't be the last. I wish that we were done, but sadly, there's more where this train wreck came from. In a recent outburst from the cancellation mob on Twitter, Wizards of the Coast, the exceedingly woke company behind Dungeons & Dragons, found themselves yet again at the hands of the woke mob. This time it was over the introduction of a race of flying ape-like humanoids called the horde that were originally enslaved and have since been liberated. Now, to me, the entire concept of an updated D&D set in the 80s as some sort of space odyssey, it just sounds awful. Then again, I'm not a D&D guy. But without fail, the minute that this new race was introduced by Wizards of the Coast, these same anti-racist people leapt to the conclusion that somehow a flying monkey in space is completely drawn from real-world African slaves. It's almost like nobody has told these woke activists that almost every civilization known to man has been enslaved at some point in their history, and that slavery still exists in many parts of the world today. This is where things get even more dicey. There are many who claim that the works of Tolkien are inherently racist due to the nature that he was an Englishman that wrote the story for an English audience that would have been overwhelmingly white English people back in the early 1900s. He wrote his stories as a mythology for the English. The Greeks have Zeus, the Egyptians Osiris, the English have Gilgalad. As the whole world was in total upheaval between the First and Second World Wars, as he was writing many of his works, it's not shocking that nationalism and ethnocentrism are recurring themes in his work, nor is it inherently wrong. Fantasy worlds are generally ethnocentric. In order to create a compelling story of cooperation and progress, it's almost necessary to have races of people that are ethnically bigoted towards each other and to have them learn to cooperate together. It makes the final chapter of the story that much more rewarding. However, you can't get to that place without taking the good with the bad. In Tolkien's work, there was little to no crossbreeding between races or ethnic groups. That was a product of the world he created, not a sign of his inherent racism. Also, regarding any comparison of the orcs in Tolkien with people of African descent, orcs were elves, not humans, but elves, that were enslaved and corrupted by Morgoth. A much closer comparison for African people would have been the Haradrim. Now, before people start to freak out at me and say, well see, he made the black people the bad guys, you should probably pick up one of Tolkien's books and start reading. Yes, the Haradrim and Easterlings at times had a long history of being on the side of evil, but so did the men of the West. There were not many human inhabitants of Middle-earth that were worthy of being considered as good people. Please also look at context and try and use some nuance. Tolkien was, after all, an Englishman in the 1900s and was creating a story for a white English audience. On what planet would anyone in his position portray the people in his story that were to be the spiritual ancestors of England as the villains? Find me a nation on this earth that has created a cultural and spiritual identity where they have painted themselves as the great evil. I'll wait. I have more thoughts on the matter, but I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping things up here. Real-world racism and bigotry are wrong. No one should ever be judged or looked at negatively because of their skin color or nation of origin. But in the process of developing a TV show or a film from a beloved group of stories, there should always be the intent to honor the lore, rather than attempting to quote-unquote modernize it to make it less problematic. The fact is, there was no outrage mob 20 years ago when Fellowship of the Ring first released in theaters. No talk of Tolkien's implicit racism. No mention of a lack of diversity. It was a story that was adapted well by the cast and crew, and though there were changes that drew the ire of many purists, The Lord of the Rings will go down in history as one of the greatest trilogies ever made. Not because of a lack of diversity, mind you, but because of the love and respect that was shown by everyone involved. If Rings of Power's showrunners had a shred of the respect for Tolkien that Peter Jackson had, they'd be looking at one of, if not the greatest, TV shows of all time. Instead, we have an unending supply of memes for the next decade. Thanks, Amazon.